tell me, William, was it this book club that originally introduced you to Rupert, or were you already following Rupert through some other means before you joined the book club? Because it was I mean, you've been in this book club right since the beginning, haven't you? So.
I was at Buckland Hall,
but
about 5 years I've been listening to Rupert. I'm an old-time student of other people, so yeah, I've been reading, Shankaracharya, starting with Shankaracharya and Krishnamurti, long in the 70s, but try to stay up, and of course Ramana since I was a teenager.
And you just discovered Rupert on YouTube, did you?
Yeah.
A lot of
yes,
people do.
Because Nisargadatta, and I used to like his student Ramesh Balsekar quite a bit. I thought he was really brilliant.
Yeah.
But anyway, I saw there was this great new teacher, and I just connected and felt at home with the teaching. So
yeah,
very happy to be here with everyone. And the whole community has been very welcoming, and appreciate that.
Yes, they have been. It's such a lovely idea of Bill's to set this up, and
yes,
I think we're all very grateful to him for doing that, because that's really nice, and we know it's a lot of work to do that.
Yes,
he works very hard at it.
Yeah, I appreciate it too very much.
So welcome everyone to the Bill-Free Pure Presence book study. We're studying chapter 14 of Jean Klein's book, I Am. And some of you will be expecting Bill or Arthur to be here, but Bill is flying right now and is unable to be with us, and I think Arthur has a family emergency. So I'm Jenny Beal, and I'm going to be your host for today. And today we have a new co-host, William Price. Very warm welcome, William. And it's lovely to be with you. William's been with us for many of the book club talks right from the beginning, when we were studying the nature of consciousness. I remember, William, you asking some questions on the Facebook page about that. And he and I met and had a chat on one of Rupert's retreats at Buckland Hall. And that was about a couple of years ago, wasn't it? Something like that.
It was in 2018, in May.
2018 May, right. Okay, not so long ago. So Bill gave William just one chapter to cover this time, chapter 14, which is starting on page 105 for those of you who've got the latest edition. But it's a long chapter, and there's an awful lot of material and ideas in it. So, William, let's make a start. Why don't you take us through some of the parts of this chapter that really struck you or are important for you?
Well, in the beginning, on the first page, Jean Klein talks about, at the very first paragraph, the identification with an object, as which they would call, Rupert would call nama, as name, and then the form nama rupa, name and form. So we identify and create an object of ourselves, out of ourselves. That's that is the projection that we create out of pure consciousness, but it doesn't really exist, but that's where we are. It's later in this next paragraph, he talks about the relative subject, and as we see ourselves as the relative subject, but not the actual subject, which is removed. So that's the first thing I got on the first page, Jenny. Do you have some other comments on that page?
I thought it was interesting when he said taking oneself to be a person is a habit, just like any other. It's the desire to be distinct from one's surroundings and different from others. And the person exists when it's formulated as a thought. But we see that it's nothing but memory, and I thought that was very good. That was very clear, and you can feel that in people, can't you? You can feel that desire to be different.
Yeah, well, it's celebrated in a lot of places, and especially in America. You know, it's very part of the American psyche to be this individual, the strong individual who goes out into the wilderness and creates, you know, whatever. But that's a big part. Where in the East it isn't so strong. It's more fitting in with the group. But it is part of our Western heritage. So society does program us that way quite a bit.
Yeah. I think. Yes.
I had a dream last night. It kind of relates to this. In my dream, it's real brief. In my dream, I was at a party, and the next thing that happened was I was walking a dog, and I was walking past the house that the dream had occurred in. Oh, so in the dream I said, oh, that's the house where the party was. Well, the dog, all of a sudden there was a bunch of other dogs, and the dog, I looked down and I had a leash, but the dog was gone. And and I thought, well, isn't that interesting, you know? So it was like my ego was like the dog dragging me around, you know, and then all of a sudden it just disappeared. So it's one of those funny things.
Yes.
So we create this Namarupa, this object out of ourselves, and it's like the dog trying to drag consciousness around behind it. Yes. A ridiculous idea.
Yes. I remember Rupert giving a metaphor about thoughts and how we can't control our thoughts, but if we see them as being like a dog, and we take a dog for a walk in the park on a long lead, and the dog goes all over the place and goes and sniffs all sorts of things. And goes and talks to other dogs, but we just stay quietly on the other end of the leash, sit on a park bench, and eventually the dog returns back to us.
Yeah, it was exactly like that. There was this moment of, where's the dog?
Yes.
Oh, the dog. I enjoyed that, yeah.
So what do you have next, William?
Oh, I was just going to look and see if anybody had a comment here. Hillary talks, yes, it's very much like King Lear and John Smith. And I thought this morning, it's kind of like Rupert's Mary and Jane metaphor that Jean Klein somewhere in this chapter talks about the chessboard gets completely blown away. We create this idea like we're a pawn. We can only go forward when somebody is in our way, and or we're a castle that can only move in straight lines, left and right. We become, and these are the restrictions that we've placed on. Ultimately, we're really Mary, the queen, who can do anything she so chooses, including fall asleep and be Jane, or one of us, as we like to consider ourselves as an object on this chessboard. So I thought, oh, just get rid of all the lines and the rows and columns and just be like the ocean,
Yes, yes. It's a beautiful metaphor, isn't it?
Mm.
Mm.
Yes.
Mm.
Another thing I liked is in this chapter was that two things. On page 106, second paragraph, Joan talks about that the understanding that the ego has no reality in itself, it springs directly from our true being. It doesn't result from any effort. That's the disappearance, but it's neither discursive nor mental, and then it brings about total presence, wholeness, where fear has no place. So it was like, oh yeah, it. He talks later about the idea of apperception.
Yes.
And I thought that was very deep. Ramesh used to talk about that. It came up in this late 18th century with Kant would talk about the apperception.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And it's this moment of it's self-inquiry, or it has a secondary meaning that which is like accumulation of memory, but then all of a sudden there's this breakthrough that totally destroys the old paradigm.
Yes.
And I thought that was really a good part of the chapter too.
Yes,
It's a
that.
nice word, apperception.
It is, yes. I'm I'm not entirely convinced that, although it is, I agree, it's instantaneous, that it's necessarily then permanent. I think
Right.
I think for most people, they need to come back to it, and often they can use the same mechanism, the same process of inquiry that they originally used, or sometimes it's with the help of Rupert, and you suddenly see him taking someone through a process of inquiry, and suddenly they get it. A few
Yeah.
days later, they've stopped getting it. If they go back over that conversation just
Yeah.
quietly, and they find it again. I think that's what he means by tracing your way back. Trace your way back to what you really are. He often uses that expression.
Yeah,
So
that's very helpful and true. We have a flash or an awakening, but it's a partial awakening, and we have to continue as basically repeating this, what I guess Rupert would call a sadhana of awakening. It, sometimes has to be repeated because we forget. And
yes.
our habits.
Yes, and he says it that path that we take to go back, it gets thicker and the more that we do it, until eventually it's not really a pathway anymore. Suddenly remember, oh no, I'm not a separate self, and there we are. But initially, we have to go back through those sorts of arguments that led us there in the first place.
You need to move your mic again,
Sorry,
Jen.
I moved my mic again. Yes. Okay. Is that
Thank
better?
you.
Mhm.
Yeah, the habits are strong. I know I have habits that I have to work on, and sometimes you just, oh, it's like you wake up in the morning and you know, oh, I always have a cup of coffee, right? Well, then you wake up and say, I think I'll try some tea. Just a little thing like that, can be incredibly freeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
He does talk about the process of going to sleep and waking up later on in the chapter. Um, I was going to ask you whether you do anything special to go to sleep, before you go to sleep, and when you wake up, before you get out of bed or anything.
Before I go to sleep, I'm usually ready to go to sleep, and I just go to sleep.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of it's almost like a remaining in the objectless consciousness of deep sleep, and trying to, in a sense, realize that is really pure being. In Sanskrit, they call it Turiya, but it's which is above all of the so-called states, because it's not a state, it's being itself, it's knowing being without objects. But so I'm going to try that, Jenny. I'm going to try to remain there for a little bit before I take my medication or have a cup of coffee, or open my eyes, and just try to do that as an experiment.
Yes, yes. It can be quite a strange time, a sort of half dream world,
Exactly.
can't it, between sleeping and waking.
Mm.
Yeah.
I've always felt that was such an interesting time, but it's so hard to recapture once you've awoken to the world of objects and started your day more or less, which is kind of strange. It reminds me of that poem by Wordsworth where the trailing, he talks about trails of glory. I forget what poem that is, but it's like that when we come into this world originally. And so waking up in the morning is really kind of like a new birth in a sense, but to consciousness, you're never asleep in the first place. So I think that's what Joan's trying to tell us.
Yes, I think so. He talks about the states being not states of consciousness, but states of the mind, and that those states flow through consciousness, doesn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. Whereas we often regard them as, well, conventionally we regard them as states of consciousness, but that's not right.
Right. Mary never actually falls asleep. I know.
Yeah. mm.
Mm. Jenny, did you, maybe you could explain the bottom of 106 and the top of 107 about where it says, how does the object give up its representation?
Yes, yes. Rupert says something very similar. He says that all um, objects shine with the light of pure knowing, and it's really the same thing. It's my understanding of it is from my own experience that all objects are myself. In fact, going back to waking up in the morning, it's what I it's what I do. It's what I make sure of, because it tends to happen fairly automatically. But I make sure that there's nothing, that I'm not seeing anything outside myself, that that I am everything, and that I'm feeling that. And on the occasions when there is a little bit of a contraction into the body and therefore things are outside, then I use one of Rupert's yoga meditations to just dissolve that contraction. I don't get out of bed. I don't put my feet on the ground until I've stabilized as that. But normally, no, I mean, I've been practicing that for, I don't know, several years, and it's normally automatic now. But that's really, I feel is what it is. What any object that you see first speaks to you of yourself. It is yourself. But he does, Rupert actually, which in contrast with Jean Klein, he actually talks about works of art, the really great works of art, as naturally taking, if you're sensitive to them, as naturally taking you back to yourself. They don't take you outwards to them as an object, which is what Jean Klein is describing. They're actually taking you back to yourself. And Rupert talks about some of Cézanne's paintings doing that, because there's no vanishing point in Cézanne's paintings.
You'll have to move your mic.
Sorry.
It slides down.
Okay.
Yeah, he talks about works of art as pointers back. And it's almost like, I can use another metaphor, you're walking at night and it's rained and there's puddles and you see the reflection of the moon in the puddles, and then what that reflection points you to, oh, the moon. And what is the moon? Nothing but the reflection of the sun, really. So
yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes, I think that I like that analogy. That's nice.
so all the objects could be like these different moons in these puddles.
Yes.
Pointing us back to the real.
Yes.
Real.
Well, one of the things Rupert's wife, Ellen, said to me, I asked her what her practice was. And she said that whenever she touches anything, she feels the love that it is made of and is surrounded by, and is obviously her love. her own being as well. And so you touch everything and you feel love. And I think it's a very beautiful practice. It's something that I quite often do. I mean, it's so simple. You can do that just with a door handle. You go to
Yeah.
open the door. When you lay the table for dinner,
Mm,
and you put
I
out the
love it.
plates and the knives and forks. Yeah.
Mm, it's lovely. Thank
Yes.
you. Let's see if we have any question. Oh, yes. I see trailing clouds of glory. Yes. Wordsworth poem.
Yes. Training clouds of glory till we come from God, who is our home. That's right. Mm.
Yes, and then Hillary's ditto great music and poetry. How true.
Yes. Yes, for me, I find it easier with music, in fact, than with paintings.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do too, actually. Or poetry. Yeah. But Rupert is working with clay and, tangible things. I have two sons who are artists, so, they're visual artists. So
Yeah.
it's a different thing. And my brother's an artist. He's been a musician all his life. So he's a few years younger. That's over 50 years of playing music. It becomes your touchstone, I
Yeah.
think. And
Yeah.
so we each have the different pointers that appeal to our nature, I believe.
Yes. Yes. And I think that's where Rupert does such a marvelous job picking up which pointers are going to work for each person. He talks about dipping a question being like a bucket that he dips
Mm,
into the ocean of awareness, and all the buckets are a different shape, but what comes out, the answer that he gives, is uniquely tailored to that person and that question at the time.
exactly. At the end of the chapter, one of the questioners asks Jean Klein, he says, it's actually the last paragraph of the chapter. You've said, live as if you were consciousness, as if you were enlightened. Is there not a great danger in this? And he basically says that if you cut to the middle of the paragraph, I don't exactly remember because it was a pedagogical saying that appeared at the moment. And I think
Yes,
that's the bucket that he was using at one
exactly.
time doesn't necessarily, it's the teaching tailors itself uh, to the question.
Yes,
Is
yes,
that your understanding too?
yes, yes, absolutely. Mm.
Thank you, Hillary. Hillary says, attune yourself to life, be one with it. And I suppose that's whatever form it is taking at the present time. I did like moving on the end of page 107 where um, the author says, the idea of being the doer is the one and only pitfall preventing you from really living. Life is free without fear. It follows its natural course. Attune yourself to life. Be one with it. And that was like the ocean metaphor.
Yes, yes. The idea of being the doer. I think people have a lot of problem with that, but it does. If you can really feel that it isn't you that does it, anything, then there is a tremendous freedom in that. And it doesn't mean that you just sit passively and do nothing all day. That's
No,
also possible, of course.
no, the
But it,
ocean will move you,
yes,
just like
it
we see in
means
the physical world.
the body mind just responds to the situation. But Jean Klein often uses the words without memory. So don't go back to memory, because memory contains so much of our conditioning, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure from Me Good, one of our panel, one of our people, refers to middle of page 109, Choiceless Awareness, which helps decondition the ego patterns. See if I can find that. Jenny, can you carry on? Someone knocked at my door. I have to tell them they have the wrong address.
Okay. Right. Well, going back to being the doer rather not being the doer, I think it's interesting that Jean Klein suggests that as a cure for anxiety, that you cannot feel anxious if you know that you are not the doer. You just allow everything to happen in the way it's going to happen. So I thought that was an interesting comment. It's something I hadn't put the two together before, and that's interesting. Only an object, the insecure ego, can be restless and anxious, and you will naturally act for the best, allowing only the circumstances to suggest to you. So again, it's all about living in the present, free from memory and conditioning, and free from any kind of belief in what should or shouldn't happen. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Everything okay now, William?
Yes, it's fine.
Right. So what else do you have?
Oh. I got a lot out of page 110
Mm-hmm.
about the inquiring state, which is this apperception can be interpreted as the inquiring, frees all the latent energies within us. And I made a little note further in that paragraph, the big first paragraph after the few lines that came from the previous page. It's about, and then this is where Jean Klein brings up apperception. He says, awakening is neither immediate nor gradual, it's instantaneous apperception. And I just, oh my gosh. And then it says, the one which we are is beyond time. When the mind realizes this, it loses its fear and desire which oscillates between having and becoming. The idea that we're this container that holds knowledge in a jar or in a drawer or whatever, that our minds are like full of all this stuff, like a lot of people have a junk drawer in their kitchen where they just put all the things that they don't belong anywhere else, and it becomes quite chaotic. So I made a little note on the sides. I wrote, hack the machine. Well, because the machine is like the controlling fears and desires that once we see them as mechanical or habitual, we can hack that, remove that code more or less from the program and remove the programming. I also thought that the next one, where living is then that shining lucidity which reveals itself as autonomous, everlasting fulfillment. And this is always a problem with some of us. We see we're looking for perfection instead of wholeness. And really, wholeness feels a whole lot better.
I love that description, Willie. That's yes. I'm one of the ones that is a bit of a perfectionist. I know Rupert is too. But yes, that is important. Rupert once said to me, "Don't look for perfection. Just always do the best you can in this moment now." Yes.
There's an old saying, don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. And I think that applies to this.
Yes, absolutely. It was interesting, isn't it, what he says about as sometimes the question, who am I, is stimulated by a crisis, but even when it is, then it always comes from your true being and has a different quality about it. And I can certainly relate to that. I don't know whether you can.
Oh, definitely, because and in those critical points of what, well, I call it a critical point of departure from the truth. It's like chaos has taken hold, and the beauty of it is that leadership or guidance will surface spontaneously. That's my experience, is that even in these, one can be completely chaos, and it occurs in groups often, organizations or groups, and then for instance, a group, let's say their guru or teacher dies, and then there's all of a sudden this great void in the minds of the chelas, the students. But really, the teaching is universal in presence, and being knowledge is universal. So leadership will spontaneously occur through the nature of knowledge being. That's my experience, at least, having had it happen to a group I was involved with.
Mm-hmm. I had a more difficult experience, I would say, in the group I was in, and Rupert was also in, when the leader died, and there was certainly a period of chaos, but unfortunately the leaders that floated to the top were the big egos, and that tends to be what Rupert says. Rupert will never set up an organization because he says that ultimately always the big egos will float to the top.
It seems to be a pattern, and if we just look at the history of religion, that has happened in nearly every single case.
Mm-hmm.
It happened in Islam, it happened in Christianity. There was no Christianity, there was only Christ and his friends. And they had to create this big structure that became the, Catholic Church. And of course, whenever you create an edifice from something that isn't material, it's bound to be, actually, it's not real. I'm trying to look for the correct word, but it's you're trying to make like a building out of the teaching, an edifice.
Yes.
Out of the teaching, the pure inspiration of the original founder. And of course, in order to maintain that fiction, all this politics starts. It happened in Islam, and there goes your Sunnis and Shias, and they've been fighting for about 1,200 years now over, it was a political problem that arose out of the loss of the prophet. So that just goes to show you how deep these problems can happen when the egos do assert themselves.
Yes, yeah. And I think he says later on in the chapter that really the best way we can interact with the world is by recognizing our true nature and just acting from that, not choosing, not deciding, just allowing the action to flow, doesn't he?
Yes. This was I thought it was very clever at the bottom of page 110. Jean Klein is at the last full paragraph, and then there's a short one after it. It's a very Zen-like thing where, so when you try to remember the face before you were born, the old Zen koan.
Yes.
In this absence of representation, you glimpse yourself, your isness or suchness, which is an objectless dimension. In the extinction of being something of your temporal birth, you find that you are is never born and never dies. So in quotes, remembering the unborn, we use memory to come to the extinction of memory. It's like Rupert's mentioned the using the thorn to remove the thorn.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and using the mind to go beyond the mind also.
See if any of our people have.
Yes, Annika has mentioned the videos on the responsibility of a teacher, and they are very good. There's 2 videos. I think they're called
Yeah.
The Responsibility of a Teacher, Part 1 and Part 2, from a couple of years back, maybe. Yes.
I'll make a note of that to watch those again. I did see one of them.
Yes, I think one of the important points he says about a teacher, which is really exactly what Jean Klein is saying towards the end of this chapter, is the real, John Klein says, the real test is whether the seeker finds himself becoming more independent or more bound to the so-called teacher. You often see gurus where they're kind of encouraging people to bind themselves to the teacher. And I think Rupert does a wonderful job, and I'm sure Jean Klein did too, because I think it flows down ultimately from Jean Klein. He does a superb job of getting people to be independent, letting them grow up, I suppose you'd say. Yeah.
That's true. It's a it's unfortunate. Let's just say when the teacher infantis creates that an infant out of the student who's always going to be looking for that breast milk, and when the teacher's gone and there's no mommy left, out on his own, pretty much. So I think that you're right. Rupert does encourage us to be the teaching yourself and not just listen to what I'm talking about, but to make it real to yourself.
Yes, to find it in your own experience. And you may have noticed that he has removed the flowers from his most recent retreats.
I had not noticed that.
Oh, well, you will when there are more YouTube clips from recent retreats,
Oh,
because he's wanting to make it clear that people should not be putting him on a pedestal. He sits on a stage just so that
I
he can
love
see
that.
people.
I know. I was always suspicious of anybody who put themselves on an upraised throne or platform. And years ago, probably 50 years ago, the teacher, Shogyung Trungpa, the Buddhist teacher, wrote a book about cutting through spiritual materialism. And these thrones and these garlands all over and all this adoration. Well, it can be, bhakti can be a beautiful experience. And when it reaches its summit, there you realize that the teacher or the adored one is oneself, actually. And
Yes.
and Rupert's always been very clear about that, which I love more deeply than if I was worshiping him up on a
Yes.
on a
Yes.
throne. I always have a vision of a throne, but nobody's sitting in it. Because anybody can sit there at any time. Even the homeless alcoholic on the street can be your teacher from time to time. You never know who's going to show you the truth.
Yes.
Did anyone have any ideas? Oh, let me see. There's a question. There's a question here from Anne.
I think it's a comment agreeing with really just what you have said about the adoration, the clothes, the gems, and the garlands can be an expression of innocent belief. It can bring one closer to the truth via the teacher, but it's great that Rupert cuts right through it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the sword, this is like a sword, which a lot of times people think of this in the mind, but it really should come from the heart and be a sword of love, not of one-upmanship. So that's the beauty.
Yes, it is. Do you have any thoughts, William, about what he says about dreams? Because I'm not sure I totally agree with him. Well, at least I don't find all
On
of what he
page
says in my own
113,
experience.
right?
Page 111.
111.
Yeah.
I was looking at, because he talked about on 113 too. Oh,
Was it there? Was it? I think maybe he talks about it earlier as well. Yeah. No, when he says he's talking about when you understand that you're not the doer, then first of all you will no longer dream, because dreaming is only an extension of the waking state of the frustrations and defenses that have not been thoroughly lived in waking life. Then he goes on to talk about uninvolved dreams. I remember there was a story. I think it comes from Francis Lucille, where he was at a meeting of Jean Klein, and they were staying in Jean Klein's house, and Jean Klein had said that he no longer had any dreams. And anyway, they discovered, or they heard Jean Klein in the middle of the night saying in his sleep, "C'est magnifique, c'est magnifique." And it became fairly obvious that perhaps he was he was dreaming, but maybe that's
that's a great story.
So maybe that's what he's referring to when he talks about an uninvolved dream. But I'm not sure. I don't remember my dreams, assuming I do dream very often, but sometimes I do. But the dreams certainly changed over the past few years. They changed in character a lot. I don't get nightmares anymore.
Oh, yeah.
Which I
Well,
used to.
yeah.
But
I don't have nightmares, but I do. I call it the puzzle palace. I do sometimes get into this like palace, and it just has all these rooms, and it's just like impossible to find the way out of it. And maybe I should just be happy to be there in the first place. It's very beautiful, and marble columns and beautiful paneling, and it's lovely. But I don't know. Christ said something about in my Father's house are many mansions.
Yeah, so maybe that's a kind of archetype that is coming up from the wider field of consciousness, perhaps.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Me good. says it's a great mystery why we even require sleep. No one can answer that. It may be the need to reconnect with pure consciousness for part of our lives. I'm not sure me good who is the one who's reconnecting with pure consciousness for part of their life. That's something you'll have to ask yourself, of course.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's a state of consciousness without objects, and it's not just in sleep that we experience that. It also happens between two thoughts, between two perceptions, and it may be that that's something the mind needs, because the mind goes away then, doesn't it? The mind's not present. Mind's only present when there's objects. So I suppose everything needs rest. It's part of the
Exactly.
part of the kind
But
of laws of the universe, isn't it? Everything needs rest.
the idea of presence is always there. I mean, it's not an idea, it actually is the noumena of, I mean, there's phenomena and noumena, but they are integrally related, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, so, and I don't know how, why, or any of the science behind it, but I know that there's always that underlying presence of knowledge that that is we call presence.
Yes, it's
Has no objects. It's a non-objective reality.
and it's present throughout all the states. It's there in the presence of apparent objects, and that's what Rupert calls the activity of consciousness. It goes on throughout all the states. So for some reason, the different states are necessary, or at least they happen. One presumes that's just part of how the universe works, I guess.
We can just accept it for now, because even Rupert will often seem to, what I get is that we ask the question, who am I? And it's really rhetorical in a sense, because any answer one might come up with would never be complete in words, certainly.
Yes, and he says that the idea of asking those sorts of questions is to not answer them, just to let the mind take you to where it believes the answer is, and it will take you to where it thinks the answer is, and you just stay there. And it's a technique. And I think Jean Klein in another book talks about bringing the mind, using a question like that to bring the mind to a stop. Well, we're not very far off the top of the hour, William. Is there
You're
anything you'd
right.
like to point us to that we that you haven't covered so far, and you'd like to end on?
Um, there was a question by one of the people at the end of page 114. They asked they made a statement to Sean Klein, and I'll read it. There are quite a few who are very lucid intellectually, who have, as you've said, a clear geometrical representation of truth. I'm not sure what that means, and I'll admit that I don't understand that, geometrical. they may, after living like this for some time, believe themselves to be enlightened. And he talks about makes a statement, the majority of teachers I've met are stuck here. What can you say about this? Can the intellectual guide be helpful, and how can one avoid or come out of it? And Jean Klein says that yes, they've conceptualized the understanding, and it has not become being understanding.
Yes, and I think what he means by geometrical, which I think he explains a lot more in Transmission of the Flame,
Okay.
is that it's understanding the underlying model. So it's like if you were a physicist, understanding the model of relativity, or understanding the standard model of particle physics. So you understand the model, but you're not feeling the reality. And I think that's what he's really saying there. They've conceptualized the understanding. Yeah.
Rupert often, at least I've heard several times, say that an intellectual understanding is a good place to start, and that it can be very helpful. And for me, at least, it's always been very helpful to have that, and then it becomes fleshed out later. It's just a skeleton, a superstructure in the mind, which is no longer necessary at a later point, but it can be helpful to focus.
Yes, I agree. I agree very much with that. I think it usually starts with an intellectual understanding of the model, and then then eventually you explore that, and then you come to feel it, and then it's something different, and you don't need the model anymore. It's redundant.
Yeah, I feel at that cusp place where the intellectual scaffolding eventually will disappear. It's only, but it is a helpful thing in the beginning, I think.
Yes. Well, I
At
think
least
we've
that seems to be the teaching that Rupert's passed on to us. It can help. Maybe for certain type of people who are very visual, or even, I mean, Einstein did these thought experiments, and and they were all in his own mind before he ever did the math or anything.
yes, exactly. Well, I think, William, we're going to have to leave it there because
Well, thank you.
we've come up to the hour. Thank you so much
Thank you,
for
everyone,
being
for
here
joining
and
us.
being with us for the first time. I think it's really great, and for putting up with me.
Yes,
So,
thank you.
and thank you all for joining us.